This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. We're here at the United in Compassion 2017 Symposium in Melbourne, Australia. I'm here talking with Dr. Greg Gerdeman, and he's got some very interesting stuff to share with regards to the application of cannabis in neuroprotective actions or states. So I guess first we need to start with a little bit of your background. How did you first become aware of or interested in the application of medicinal cannabis?
I went to graduate school in the mid-90s to study cellular neurosciences, systems neuroscience, basically the cellular mechanisms of learning and memory in the brain. That was my direction.
Mm-hmm.
And this was Vanderbilt University in the pharmacology department in 1996 is when I started. And so my interest was in very mechanistic questions about how brain cells communicate, how they adjust themselves during processes of learning, and also, as it came to be, how they protect themselves to injury. That wasn't a motivating force. I was more interested in learning and memory. In the course of doing that, to make a long story short, we hypothesized and later came to demonstrate that the endogenous THC molecules in our brain, that what we call the endocannabinoids, which were only very recently discovered at that time. We knew that they existed. You've got these THC-like molecules that we call endocannabinoids, but people didn't know really the physiology of what they were doing. And what we came to find out is that they are released by neurons, brain nerve cells, in a way that feeds back on incoming inputs, and it's a negative feedback to scale down overactivity. That's very relevant to how our learning and memory systems work. We're discovering mechanisms about how the brain works, but it became, of course, incredibly relevant and interesting right away that it's how cannabis works and how it interacts with processes of learning and memory. So I was doing a very basic neuroscience field, came to discover this system that cannabis acts on. And so writing a PhD dissertation on this mechanism, you do a deep dive into the literature and the dissonance between what was going on from a policy direction in the United States for decades, and was very active in the 90s with drug policy czars, as we call them, saying there's no shred of evidence that marijuana has any benefit. And I was learning both modern cutting-edge research. I was looking at old ancient literature that cannabis had been used therapeutically, and that was like, really? It's that old? That was my entry into that understanding. It's been used as medicine for thousands of years, and in the United States, it was a huge part of the pharmacopoeia. I was learning that, and in the lab, I was learning mechanisms that gave face value to. If you were just discovering the system and you didn't know it was related to cannabis, you would say, wow, we've discovered an innate system of neuroprotection. And indeed, that is a very mainstream science view. We view the endocannabinoid system and the cannabinoid receptors that cannabis works through as an innate system of neuroprotection, protectors of brain health.
Now, this is something that's very interesting because we have this concept in the complementary sort of field that antioxidants protect things,
Yes.
and I think that theory needs to be discarded and evolved. So, with regards to the ECS, what I think is very interesting is that it seems that foods that we eat, herbs that we might use for medicinal uses, they seem to have some effect on the endocannabinoid system, not just cannabis.
Yes.
Itself.
We're learning a lot about that, though I will add that many of the cannabinoids, including THC and cannabidiol, are more potent antioxidants than vitamin E, which is like first line antioxidant benchmark.
Yeah.
But they do many other
That's
things.
in vitro, right?
Yes, fair enough. There are a number of other natural products, herbs that we are learning have activity to modulate and in ways enhance or sort of feed and support the endocannabinoid system. The endocannabinoids are biochemically they're polyunsaturated fatty acids, and there's very scholarly work looking at how if you supplement animals with fish oils and omega-3 fatty acids and these kinds of supplements that are widely believed to help promote neural health, it alters, it very directly becomes a precursor pool for endocannabinoids. So the connection between various dietary herbal modalities and the endocannabinoid system is very robust and an exciting area.
So the nervous system being the electrical system of the whole body, the communication network or a major communication network as well, not just for nerve signals, but indeed for things like, pain is an obvious one, but there seems to be this interaction with our endocrine immune system as well. Talk to us, tell us about the research that you've been doing and the applications with regards to neuroprotective activity in various disease states. So where does it really shine? Where does cannabis really shine?
Well, so much of it has to be dependent on the preclinical models and especially animal research.
Yep.
And as someone who's participated in animal research for many years, and I no longer really am very active in that. I tend to be reviewing other people's work now. But there's such a body of animal literature that supports the cannabinoids, THC and CBD in particular, as having pronounced anti-inflammatory effects. And that's one way to address your question, that we now are learning increasingly that so many chronic neurodegenerative conditions, either maybe with an autoimmune component like multiple sclerosis.
I'm thinking also Crohn's gut conditions as well.
Crohn's is chronic inflammation. Parkinson's disease, though, and Alzheimer's disease, and these chronic age-related neurodegenerative conditions have a very pronounced component that are related to chronic neuroinflammation that is not well treated. And in study after study, replicated and sort of developed further by many different groups around the world, the cannabinoids help to mitigate and dampen neuroinflammation. So the notion that you would expect them to be protective is very, very strong. And again, the United States federal government owns a patent on CBD and THC as neuroprotectants. This was work that came out of the National Institute of Mental Health in the lab of a esteemed Nobel laureate professor, Dr. Julius Axelrod, discovered and demonstrated and published research that THC and CBD had strong antioxidant capabilities, could be neuroprotective in vitro in models. And they own a patent on it as neuroprotectant.
But they're isolated compounds, right? Is that what he patented?
Yes, they were the specific compounds.
So you've spoken on the virtue, if you like, of the whole plant versus the isolated pharmaceutical extract.
I have.
Take us through that. What are the pitfalls when you use an isolated versus a broad spectrum whole plant type extract? And indeed, one of my questions that I need to ask before I will forget it, and this is a classic, is the aspect of memory. I'm not a user, but with regards to, we have this image in our minds about, the old hippie getting stoned and not remembering anything. Indeed, it was played on in a movie where the hippie sort of goat, it was an animated movie, and the hippie goat was actually the one that had the best memory. So how do you find the word was touted, was bandied around before, the assertions, our biases, preconceived ideas about what cannabis does, and what does cannabis actually do with memory?
Yes.
So there's one.
Well,
there's a triple-barreled question for you.
I may not hit all the barrels right away, but an important piece of that is cannabis research has been dominated by what I refer to as a pernicious institutional bias to ask negative questions.
Right.
And it has to do with primarily the funding prerogative of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They fund studies to demonstrate risk or to test hypotheses of risk. I have written those grants myself when I was getting started, and my research very much influenced me because it demonstrated a rationale that cannabis could be neuroprotective, but I can tell you, I wrote the grant from a perspective of how it might be damaging, because that's how it gets funded.
Really?
But that's changing now. The endocannabinoid system has really liberated cannabis from that, strictly from the drug
So
abuse
you
paradigm.
tried to disprove the action and ended up proving.
I framed the hypothesis
Yeah.
as such that it was important to ask the question about whether there was, we could learn something about transitions to addiction and this kind of. So I framed it primarily within a negative
And findings?
angle. Well, the findings were that that cannabinoids, that THC blocks the release of glutamate in these certain areas of the brain, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, and it's very relevant to neuroprotection. But what I want to get to is your question of bias and stigma, that does pervade so much of the literature that we know about cannabis. So much of the literature is about risk, right? So the questions may be about, say, learning on memory. There's the questions of acute effects of cannabis on memory, and whether there's long-term lasting effects, long-term neurocognitive damage, if you will, is how it gets phrased. And what do we know? We know a lot about the neural circuits of explicit declarative memory, and that the cannabinoids come in and, I guess I like to say, interrupt processes of short-term memory. And in the acute phase of cannabis use, certainly with high THC, part of the unwanted suite of experiences, side effects therapeutically. Most people do not want to have that aspect of the high that includes forgetfulness. I mean, it's a pretty well-known thing, right? But there is no good evidence that there's, in my view, in whole, when you look at studies across the board about long-term cognitive deficits, really, the evidence suggests maybe subtle differences, such as the drop of a few IQ points, which I don't want to be too dismissive about, but some studies find it, like long-term heavy cannabis users have a slight decrease in IQ. Some studies don't, that are also very well controlled. So there is indication that there's some subtle change in neurocognitive function. But this emerges from human studies of long-term, chronic, high THC use. Young people who start smoking high-potency THC cannabis at the age of 14 and do it every day for years and years. There may be, what I think empirically it should be said, subtle changes in the outcome of those users. And that is what drives the debate. Or likewise, the risk of psychosis, which much research has gone into this. Very expensive research in certain studies. Again, it's a mixed bag. Some really high-quality studies show that if there may be an increased association with psychosis in cannabis users, or that people with what we call sort of a propensity or genetic prodrome to become schizophrenic, they may be more likely to have that a quickness to that psychotic break if they're heavy cannabis users. But overall, you're talking about an odds ratio of that's quite low. You're talking about maybe a 1.8 chance greater that someone will develop this sort of psychosis. Well, you compare that to something like kids who start smoking cigarettes before the age of 15, and the level, they've got like a 6-time greater. That's the thing, the disparity. When you look at tobacco and alcohol, the long-term outcomes on neurocognitive function, the effects on brain structure, which is something else we should touch on, is just much more robust and damning for alcohol and tobacco. And of course, we're talking about a medicinal product with cannabis. We're talking about medicinal users using much less and in different contexts than these chronic studies that indicate any real threat of risk at all. So that these fears, and dear God, let's protect the children, as authentic and important as that motivation is, the scientific grounding does not support having this sort of panic where you have these extra hurdles to cannabis that are not applied to things like antipsychotic drugs that have such an incredible list of known side effects. Long-term, tardive dyskinesia, you'll have Parkinson's for life if you take these antipsychotic drugs for too long. But at least we know the risks, and so clinicians still do that.
I've got to say, you and I need to have a podcast because I could talk to you for hours, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I've got to thank you so much for... I mean, it was very unfair of me to ask you to put neuroscience into 5 minutes. So
perhaps I went a bit
but you
too
did
long.
it very succinctly, so I've got to say thank you so much for joining us on
Thank
FX
you.
Medicine. This is FX Medicine. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook.